For 18 years, Corporal Warren Briggs stole $278,000 from innocent black drivers in Pembroke, Alabama, using a dim license plate trick and Sheriff Stark's protection. But at 4 p.m., on a windy October afternoon on Highway I-65, his next prey was a deadly trap. Gideon Ross, a veteran DOJ Inspector General, showed up dressed as a poor mechanic in a beat-up Ford Crown Vic with $3,500 decoy cash. When Briggs forced him to kneel on the roadside and humiliated him, Gideon patiently endured it to record the crime with his button camera. A tough legal battle against the local powers officially began. With Pembroke County's brutal protection network, can Gideon bring the case to light before they silence him? 10 minutes before that stop, Gideon Ross was just an old man checking an engine. He knelt by his dusty Ford Crown Victoria on the shoulder of I-65. Cotton fields stretched out on both sides, dry and pale under the afternoon sun. Wind pushed grit across the asphalt. It stung his eyes and settled on his lips. He wore a denim jacket, worn soft at the elbows. His ball cap had faded from years in the sun. He had smeared black engine grease across his knuckles that morning. It hid the smooth hands of a man who read legal briefs for a living. For 3 weeks, Gideon had lived in Pembroke as someone else. He rented a small room near the train tracks for $15 a night. The walls were thin. Trains rattled the windows every few hours. He ate cold hot dogs for dinner most nights, straight from the package. He did this on purpose. A real mechanic would look tired and thin. A real mechanic would not smell like soap or wear clean shoes. Gideon studied every detail. He wanted Warren Briggs to see exactly what Briggs expected to see. He had learned this trick decades earlier, working undercover in cities far from Alabama. People rarely looked past the surface. A tired face and worn clothes made most men stop asking questions. It was a strange kind of power, being underestimated on purpose. Gideon had used it more times than he could count. Today, it might be the only thing standing between him and real danger. The whole county feared the sound of a patrol siren. Black drivers called it the Pembroke tax. Officers pulled them over for made-up reasons. Then officers took their cash under a law called civil asset forfeiture. No charges, no trial, just gone. At the local diner, folks lowered their voices whenever a patrol car rolled past the window. Mothers warned their sons to keep both hands on the wheel at every stop. Old-timers still remembered names of drivers who lost everything on that highway. Nobody filed complaints anymore. Complaints went nowhere in Pembroke County. The sheriff's office handled its own investigations, and every single one ended the same way. Officers were always cleared. Drivers were always blamed. Gideon heard these stories every day while pretending to fix cars that barely needed fixing. He listened at the gas station. He listened at the laundromat. Each story added another brick to the case, building quietly in his mind. He never wrote anything down in public. He memorized details instead, the way he had trained himself to do decades earlier. Names, dates, small facts nobody else seemed to notice. It was slow work, but it was steady. At night, alone in his rented room, he closed his eyes and pictured the notebooks Silas had sent him. Page after page of stolen dignity. He thought about the shaky handwriting at the bottom of that last page. Down the road, past a shuttered gas station, an old court clerk named Silas Avery kept the county's paper records. Silas was thin and stooped, with tired eyes that had seen too much. He pretended to be hard of hearing. It let him listen without anyone noticing. Silas had watched the pattern for years. Officers stopped drivers. Officers took cash. The county never charged anyone with a crime. He wrote every case down in a leather notebook, one line at a time, for 18 years. 3 months earlier, in Washington, D.C., Gideon sat in his office at the Department of Justice. A plain brown package arrived, with no return address. Inside was Silas Avery's leather notebook, worn soft and smelling faintly of mildew. Gideon opened it slowly. Page after page listed traffic stops. Each line had a date, a driver's name, a license plate, and an amount of cash taken. The total came to $278,000 over 18 years. At the bottom of the last page, someone had written in shaky handwriting. It said, "If you don't come, I-65 will keep being a graveyard for our dignity." Gideon read that line 3 times. His hands felt cold. He was 64 years old. Retirement was 6 months away. He had earned it after 35 years chasing dirty police units across the country. He could have closed the notebook and let someone else handle it. Gideon had built his whole career on patience. He started as a young field agent in Detroit, learning to watch and wait before ever making a move. Over the decades, he took down 4 different corrupt police units. Each case had taught him something new. He learned that bad officers rarely acted alone. Somewhere above them sat a boss who looked away on purpose, trading silence for a cut of the profits. He thought about his own father, a mail carrier who once got pulled over for no reason at all back in the 1970s. That memory had never really left him, not once in all these years. Gideon ran his thumb along the notebook's worn leather cover. It felt soft, almost delicate, like it had been held too many times by too many worried hands. He thought about the person who had risked everything to send it. He didn't know Silas Avery's name yet. He only knew someone out there was very worried enough to trust a stranger in Washington. That kind of trust, Gideon believed, deserved an answer. Instead, he requested a secret operation. He called it Operation Desert Storm, though nothing about Pembroke looked like a desert. His bosses at DOJ headquarters were not eager to approve it. They called Pembroke County a dark zone for law enforcement. Sheriff Raymond Stark controlled the local judges. He controlled the state representative too. Sending in one aging inspector seemed risky to nearly everyone in the room. His direct supervisor, a careful man named Deputy Director Hale, pushed back hardest of all. "You want to go in alone," Hale said, shaking his head slowly. "No backup. No local support. That's not a plan, Gideon. That's a funeral." Gideon argued that a large task force would only spook Stark's network. Word traveled fast in a small county. One quiet man in a beat-up car could slip in, where a dozen agents never could. Hale finally agreed, but only after Gideon promised strict rules. Weekly check-ins, a hard deadline, an emergency rescue team standing by at all times, ready to move the moment something went wrong. That night, Gideon sat at his kitchen table with his wife, Sarah. She had made his favorite pot roast, but neither of them touched much of it. Sarah's eyes were red before he even said a word. "You're 64, she said quietly. 6 more months, and you get your pension. Why walk into a place that eats federal agents alive?" Gideon didn't answer right away. He thought about the scars on his shoulder from an old case gone wrong. He thought about every driver in that notebook who never got justice. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were cold. "I'm not asking you to stop caring," she said softly. "I'm asking you to remember you're not 25 anymore." "I know how old I am," Gideon replied gently. "But somebody wrote that letter because they believe good people still show up. I can't be the reason that belief dies." Sarah wiped her eyes and nodded slowly, though worry never fully left her face. She had married a man who ran toward danger instead of away from it. Some habits, she knew, never really changed. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror later that night. He studied his own face, tired but steady. He had spent his whole career protecting the law. He was not ready to stop now. 2 days later, he drove 15 miles outside Pembroke to an abandoned diner. Its windows were boarded, and weeds grew through cracks in the parking lot. Silas Avery waited inside, checking the door every few seconds. Silas looked terrified. His hands shook as he poured coffee from a battered thermos. Steam rose from the cracked mug, and his eyes kept darting toward the boarded window near the door. He told Gideon that Briggs never turned the stolen cash in right away. Instead, Briggs kept it in a personal safe at the station for 24 hours before splitting it with Stark. "Briggs is greedy," Silas said, "but Stark is the real poison. To bring down Stark, you need Briggs to sign a fake federal seizure form with his own hand." He handed Gideon an old brass key. It opened the back door of the Pembroke police station, a door nobody bothered locking properly. "Be careful," Silas warned. "These men have hurt people before, and no one ever asked questions." Silas explained how he had kept his notebook hidden for years, tucked inside a hollowed-out Bible on his kitchen shelf. He wrote in it late at night, after his wife had gone to sleep. "I told myself somebody would come eventually," Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every year that passed, I stopped believing it a little more. Then I decided to stop waiting and just send it. Gideon studied the old man's face, lined with years of quiet fear. He recognized something familiar there, the same weight he had seen on witnesses in a dozen other broken towns. You didn't have to send that notebook, Gideon said. But you did. That took more courage than most people ever find in a lifetime. Silas looked down at his hands and said nothing, but his shoulders relaxed just slightly. Before they parted, Silas gave him one more warning. Stark checked the county's police radios every morning himself, listening for anything unusual. Gideon would need to move fast once the stop began. Gideon thanked him and drove back toward the county line. He spent the next 2 days building his disguise. He dyed streaks of gray into his hair and shuffled like his knees ached with every step. He placed $3,500 in cash inside an envelope, all of it dusted with invisible tracking powder. He hid it in the glove compartment of his old Ford. Then he switched on a tiny camera clipped inside a shirt button. A second camera sat hidden behind the dashboard, angled toward the driver's seat. Both cameras fed data to a small satellite transmitter tucked under the passenger seat. Everything was ready by 4 o'clock that October afternoon. Gideon practiced his cover story one more time in the mirror. A tired mechanic, driving to visit his sick grandson. Nothing to hide, nothing unusual, just an old man on a long drive. He checked the transmitter twice, then a third time, making sure the signal reached the satellite dish bolted onto his trunk. One failed connection could ruin 3 months of careful planning in a single afternoon. He thought briefly about Sarah, back home in Washington, probably staring at her phone waiting for his nightly check-in call. He pushed the thought aside. There was work to do first. Wind picked up outside, rattling loose gravel against the Ford's rusted fender. Dust devils spun across the cotton fields in the distance. Gideon took one slow breath and turned the key in the ignition. The Crown Victoria rolled down I-65 at a slow, careful pace. Heat still rose off the pavement even in October. Gideon watched his mirrors, waiting. When a black Dodge Charger appeared behind him, he knew there was no turning back now. Corporal Warren Briggs stood 6'3", built like a linebacker gone to muscle. His head was shaved smooth and his mustache thick. He wore mirrored aviator sunglasses that hid his eyes completely. Tactical gear stretched tight across his chest. His duty belt sagged under the weight of a pistol, handcuffs, and a heavy radio. For 18 years, he had been the county's top earner in forfeiture cash, and nobody ever asked him to explain it. He worked under Sheriff Raymond Stark, who protected him at every turn. Briggs led the county's so-called anti-trafficking task force. In truth, the task force mostly stopped black drivers on quiet stretches of highway. Briggs told himself a different story about his own work. He believed he was protecting the county from criminals hiding in plain sight. Every stop, every seizure, felt justified inside his own mind. He kept a small collection of award wall awards on his office wall, proof of 18 years of outstanding service. Not one of those wall awards mentioned the families left with empty gas tanks and unpaid rent. Briggs trusted the dashboard camera system in his own patrol car completely. He had personally requested the upgrade 2 years earlier, bragging about it to anyone who would listen. He never imagined it might one day work against him. He also had a habit of signing approval forms without reading them closely. Paperwork bored him. Signatures felt like a formality, something clerks worried about, not real police work. That habit would matter more than he ever guessed. His lights flashed red and blue behind Gideon's Ford. Briggs banged his flashlight against the driver's window before Gideon had even stopped rolling. Out of the car, he barked. License plate lights out. The excuse was a lie. The light worked fine. But excuses never mattered much on this stretch of road. Gideon stepped out slowly, playing the part of a nervous old man with bad knees. Far down the highway, a young trucker named Marcus pulled his rig onto the shoulder. He had seen the stop and grabbed his phone to film it. He wanted to help, even from a distance. Briggs spotted him instantly. He drew his taser and pointed it toward the truck. "Get out of here before I arrest you for obstruction," he shouted. Marcus paused, then pulled away, leaving Gideon alone on the roadside. Marcus gripped his steering wheel hard as he drove off, glancing back through his mirror. Guilt gnawed at him for leaving an old man alone with an angry officer. He had never felt so powerless behind the wheel. He pulled into a gas station 2 miles down the road and sat there for several minutes, phone still in hand. Part of him wanted to turn around and go back, but fear won out that afternoon. He didn't know it yet, but the short video clip on his phone would matter later. For now, all he could do was drive on, hoping the old man would be okay. Briggs searched the Ford roughly, tossing papers onto the seat. He found the envelope of cash in the glove box and laughed out loud. Drug money, he sneered. Some old man running cash for a gang. Gideon needed Briggs to talk more, to reveal everything on camera. He dropped to his knees on the hot gravel shoulder. He let his voice crack and begged, inventing a story about needing the money for his sick grandson's heart surgery. Briggs grew bolder with every word. He stood over Gideon, fanning the cash near his face, laughing at his own cruelty. "Old man, like you shouldn't be carrying this kind of money anyway," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. He pulled out a small notebook and scribbled a fake receipt in blue ink, admitting he was taking the cash, without any real paperwork. It was exactly the evidence Gideon needed, written in Briggs's own hand. Just then, static crackled through Briggs's radio. Sheriff Stark's voice came through, warning about a black SUV spotted near the county line, a vehicle known to belong to the Justice Department. Briggs turned and studied Gideon's old Ford more closely. He noticed a thin wire poking out from the edge of the dashboard. Suspicion flickered across his face for the first time that afternoon. He drew his service pistol and pressed it against the back of Gideon's head. He forced Gideon's face down onto the hot metal hood. Then he grabbed a baton and smashed the dashboard apart, searching for hidden cameras. Plastic cracked and splintered under each swing. Gideon's heart pounded hard against his ribs. He kept his breathing steady, forcing himself to think instead of panic. The button camera on his shirt sat only inches from Briggs's furious face. One glance down, and everything would be over. 3 months of planning could collapse in a single second. Sweat rolled down Gideon's temple, stinging his eyes. The hood burned against his cheek, but he did not flinch. He needed one more moment, one more distraction, to protect the evidence still recording quietly. Gideon had one option left. He faked a sudden asthma attack, collapsing to the ground and shaking violently. It pulled Briggs's attention away from the button camera still recording quietly on his shirt. Disgusted, Briggs backed away from the sick old man twitching in the dirt. He grabbed Gideon's car keys and drove off in the patrol car, leaving him alone as the sun sank low over the fields. Gideon lay still for several minutes, catching his breath for real this time. Then he pushed himself up, every joint aching from the fall. Night was coming fast, and he had 3 miles left to walk. He walked along the dark shoulder of I-65 for nearly an hour. Wind whipped dust into his eyes. His knees, no longer just for show, ached with every step forward. Eventually, he reached a small auto shop, with its lights off, the closed sign hanging crooked in the window. This belonged to Reggie Evans, a mechanic Silas had mentioned as trustworthy and kind. Reggie had no idea who Gideon really was. He saw only an old man limping and bleeding at his door. Without hesitation, Reggie brought him inside, gave him warm water, and cleaned the cuts on his knees. While Reggie worked, he talked about his own troubles with Briggs. Years earlier, the officer had taken $2,300 meant for new parts, forcing Reggie's shop toward bankruptcy. His voice shook as he described that day. "I had customers waiting on repairs," Reggie said, wrapping a bandage around Gideon's knee. "Couldn't order parts. Couldn't pay my helper. Lost half my regulars within a year." He shook his head slowly at the memory. Gideon listened closely, letting the old mechanic talk. Every detail matched what he already suspected from Silas's notebook. Reggie's story was just one thread in a much larger pattern of theft. "You didn't deserve that," Gideon said quietly. Reggie shrugged, the way people do when they've stopped expecting fairness a long time ago. "Nobody around here gets what they deserve," he replied. "You just learn to keep going." Gideon wanted badly to tell him the truth right then. He wanted to promise justice was coming soon. Instead, he simply thanked Reggie again and rested, waiting for the night to grow darker. Quietly, Gideon connected his hidden camera to the satellite transmitter under his seat. Within minutes, the footage uploaded to DOJ servers in Washington. Briggs's face, his cruel words, and the fake receipt were now lasting evidence. Gideon thanked Reggie for his kindness, but said nothing about his true identity. He knew it wasn't safe yet. He promised silently that Reggie would be repaid, and repaid well, before this was over. That night, Gideon made his way to an abandoned grain warehouse on the edge of town. He peeled off his torn denim jacket and unpacked a clean, sharp suit from a hidden bag in his trunk. FBI agent Carter met him there along with 12 heavily armed U.S. Marshals. Carter had flown in earlier that day, ready to move the moment Gideon confirmed the evidence was solid. They spread a map of the Pembroke station across a folding table. Carter worried that Stark might use armed local deputies to resist and destroy records before they could be seized. Carter had worked with Gideon once before, years earlier, on a case in Mississippi. He trusted the older man's judgment, even when it seemed too calm for the danger ahead. "You look tired," Carter said. "I am tired," Gideon admitted, rubbing his sore knee. "But I've waited 18 years too long already, same as everybody on that list." Carter nodded and turned back to the map, without another word. They reviewed the layout of the station 3 separate times. Front entrance, back door, Stark's private office, and the small evidence room, where Briggs kept his personal safe. Every exit had to be covered. One young marshal asked if Stark might have his own weapons stored somewhere in the building. Carter confirmed rumors of an hidden gun locker, adding one more reason for extreme caution at dawn. "We won't fire first," Gideon said firmly. "I want Briggs to see justice arrive exactly where he thought he was untouchable." The marshals nodded, checking their gear one final time before dawn. The next morning, at 8:15, sunlight spilled through the blinds of Sheriff Stark's office. Briggs sat with his boots on the desk, sipping coffee and tossing the $3,500 envelope toward Stark for their usual split. Without warning, the office door burst open. U.S. Marshals flooded the room, rifles raised. Briggs reached for his weapon out of habit, but 3 barrels were already pressed against his neck before he could move. Gideon Ross walked in slowly, wearing his crisp DOJ suit, a gold Inspector General badge glinting on his chest. He tossed the badge onto the desk, right on top of the stolen cash. He pressed a button on a small speaker. Briggs's own voice filled the room, laughing about the fake receipt, bragging about 18 years of stolen cash. Every word landed like a hammer blow. Stark tried to bluster, threatening to call the county attorney and demanding everyone leave his office. Gideon calmly placed an emergency federal warrant on the desk, signed personally by the Attorney General of the United States. The charges were serious: organized civil rights violations and extortion under color of law. Briggs's face drained of color as the truth sinking in set in. The frail old man from yesterday now stood before him like a judge delivering a verdict. "You," Briggs whispered, his voice cracking for the first time. "You were the old man on the highway." Gideon said nothing. He simply nodded once, letting the silence do the rest of the talking. The marshals cuffed Briggs and let him out through the same hallway where he had bullied drivers for fake violations for years. Deputies who once obeyed his every word now stood frozen, watching in stunned silence. Sheriff Stark tried one last time to claim his innocence, insisting he knew nothing about the forfeiture scheme. Agent Carter simply pointed to 18 years of records already seized from the safe in Briggs's office. Within hours, news spread through Pembroke County like wildfire. People who had been afraid to speak for years suddenly found their voices. Reporters from Montgomery and Birmingham began arriving by early afternoon. At the diner, where locals once whispered about patrol cars, the mood shifted overnight. Waitresses turned up the radio to hear updates. Customers argued loudly about details, no longer afraid of who might be listening. Some deputies who had worked under Stark for years came forward with their own stories. A few admitted they had suspected wrongdoing, but stayed silent, afraid of losing their jobs, or worse. One young deputy, named Officer Paul Dunlap, told investigators he had once tried filing a report about a strange cash shortage. His supervisor had buried the paperwork within a single day. Dunlap later told his story in federal court. He described years of silence, long before Briggs ever pulled Gideon over. His words helped the lawyers build an even stronger case against the department. Meanwhile, Marcus the trucker heard the news on his radio while driving through Tennessee. He pulled over just to sit quietly for a moment, relieved that his small act of courage had actually mattered. At the federal trial months later, the courtroom overflowed, with families who had lost money to Briggs over nearly 2 decades. Many wept openly as the lawyers read case after case from Silas Avery's careful notebook. Gideon sat quietly in the back row most days, choosing not to draw attention to himself. This was never about him, he told anyone who asked. It was about the people finally getting their day in court. Briggs's lawyer tried arguing that the seized cash followed standard procedure every single time. The judge grew visibly impatient, especially after watching the button camera footage from that October afternoon on I-65. The footage played twice for the jury. Briggs's own voice, cruel and confident, filled the courtroom speakers. Several jurors looked away from the screen, unable to watch his laughter as he mocked a kneeling old man. Prosecutors called witness after witness. Reggie Evans described losing his shop. Althea Brooks described the humiliation of being searched in front of her students during a school field trip stop years earlier. By the final day, even Briggs's own defense attorney seemed to expect the verdict everyone else already knew was coming. When the jury foreman read the guilty verdict aloud, a wave of quiet sobbing spread through the courtroom. Some people cried from relief. Others cried simply because justice had finally arrived, years too late, but real all the same. Warren Briggs received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison, without bail, at a facility in Coleman, Florida. He would spend the prime of his remaining life behind bars for his crimes. Sheriff Raymond Stark received 15 years for working together to break the law and hiding stolen money. His badge, worn for over 2 decades, was stripped from him in front of television cameras outside the courthouse. The full $278,000 in stolen cash was frozen by federal authorities. Every dollar, along with accumulated interest, was returned to the victims whose lives had been upended on that stretch of highway. A new organization, called the Avery Evans Justice Fund, was created using additional seized assets from the corrupt sheriff's office. It would help other families across Alabama fight unfair asset seizures in the future. The fund hired a small staff of lawyers who worked free of charge for anyone claiming unfair seizure across the state. Within its first year, the fund helped return money to dozens of other families outside Pembroke County. County officials, eager to stay away from Stark's legacy, approved new rules limiting how officers could seize cash during traffic stops. Every seizure now required a judge's signature. Within 24 hours, no exceptions. A community meeting was held at the local church a few weeks after the trial ended. Dozens of residents showed up, many sharing their own stories publicly for the very first time in years. Silas Avery stood at the front of the room that evening, his notebook resting on the podium beside him. He didn't say much, just thanked everyone for finally believing that change was possible. Reggie Evans received back his $2,300, along with a brand new set of tools donated by the Justice Department. He reopened his shop with a fresh coat of paint and a hand-painted sign out front. On opening day, half the town showed up just to see it. Neighbors brought lawn chairs and set them up in the gravel lot. Someone brought a cooler full of sweet tea and passed out paper cups. Reggie stood by his new sign, hands shaking slightly, as he cut a small red ribbon stretched across the door. Customers lined up for oil changes they didn't really need, just to support him. A schoolteacher named Althea Brooks, who had lost $1,800 during a stop 2 years earlier, received her money back as well. She used it to restock the shelves of her elementary school's library. Althea invited Gideon to visit the library once the new books arrived. He stood quietly near the back of the room, watching children pick out titles they had never seen on the shelves before. One little girl asked her teacher why so many new books had suddenly appeared. Althea smiled and told her simply that some grown-ups had finally decided to make things right. Silas Avery, the quiet clerk who had risked everything by mailing that notebook, was finally recognized publicly for his courage. Reporters called him the conscience of Pembroke County, a title he wore with humble pride. Months later, on a warm afternoon, Gideon Ross sat outside Reggie's freshly painted repair shop. He had officially retired from the Justice Department, closing a 35-year career with one final, quiet victory. He wore his old denim jacket again, not as a disguise this time, but simply because he liked it. The sun stretched long shadows across the gravel lot as customers came and went. Reggie stepped outside with 2 cups of black coffee, handing one to Gideon before settling into the chair beside him. 2 older black men, once separated by hidden rank and secret purpose, now sat as equals. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The sound of Reggie's hammer, tapping steadily inside the shop earlier that morning, still echoed faintly in Gideon's mind like a heartbeat returning to normal. Justice, Gideon thought quietly, was never only about handcuffs and courtrooms. Sometimes it was simply the peace returned to people whose dignity had been stolen for far too long. Back in Washington, the case became required reading for new DOJ inspectors. Instructors used it to teach patience, careful evidence gathering, and the quiet courage it takes to stand up to deep-rooted local power. Marcus, the young trucker who had tried to help that day, later got a letter from the Justice Department. It thanked him for his courage on the highway. He kept it framed above his desk. The stretch of I-65 near mile marker 142 looked the same as it always had, dry fields stretching toward the horizon. But something in the air along that road had shifted for good. Drivers who once slowed down in fear now drove a little easier past that spot. The siren that once meant terror had lost some of its old power over the county's black residents. Silas Avery kept working at the courthouse while longer, though people said his hearing seemed to improve overnight once Stark was gone. He no longer needed to pretend not to notice things. Every year, on the anniversary of the arrest, Reggie Evans and Gideon Ross still meet for coffee outside the shop. Neither man calls it a tradition. It simply happens, quiet and steady, like the town itself finally settling into something like peace. Sarah visits Pembroke twice a year now, always bringing a small gift for Reggie's grandchildren. She jokes that her husband finally found a retirement hobby, even if that hobby involves federal court hearings and old police records. Gideon still keeps his worn denim jacket hanging by the front door at home. Sarah once offered to throw it out, calling it an old rag. He asked her to leave it right where it was. Silas Avery passed his old court clerk job to his nephew a year later, choosing finally to rest after decades of quiet watching. He kept a single page from his notebook framed above his kitchen table. Reporters occasionally still call, hoping for a follow-up story about the case that changed Pembroke County. Gideon usually declines politely, saying the real story belongs to the people who lived it, not to him. And somewhere in a federal archive in Washington, a leather notebook sits kept safe behind glass. Its worn pages, filled with careful handwriting, remain a lasting record of 18 years nobody should ever forget. Visitors to the small display sometimes pause at that glass case longer than anywhere else in the building. They read the shaky handwriting on the final page, still easy to read, after everything that followed. It reminds them that one honest voice, however quiet, can still change everything. Back on I-65, the wind still blows across the cotton fields every October, just like it always has. But these days, when a patrol car passes, fewer drivers hold their breath. That alone, Gideon believes, was worth every risk he took.